No one inside that hall expected humiliation. The room was glowing with crystal lights and quiet confidence, the kind of place where money didn't speak loudly because it never had to. Every table carried a name people recognized. Every handshake meant something. Chuck Norris stood near the edge of the gathering with his family, not seeking attention, not drawing it either. Calm posture, relaxed shoulders, just present. To most people in the room, he looked like another guest. Until one man decided to remind everyone who he believed truly mattered. The man wore a perfectly tailored suit, the kind that announced power before he ever spoke. He had spent the entire evening surrounded by laughter, executives leaning in when he talked, servers rushing when he lifted a finger. Confidence had followed him his entire life, and so had arrogance. He stepped toward Chuck casually, holding a glass of water as if continuing a joke. No warning, no hesitation. The water splashed directly across Chuck's face. The sound was soft, but the silence that followed was thunderous. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman near the wall gasped quietly. Someone whispered, "Did he just do that?" Water dripped from Chuck's jacket onto the marble floor. His wife froze, his son shifted forward, then hesitated. Everyone waited for an explosion, for anger, for shouting, for something dramatic. But Chuck didn't react. He didn't wipe his face immediately. He didn't speak. He simply looked at the man, steady, controlled, unreadable. The man laughed nervously. "Relax, it's just water." But no one laughed with him, because something in the air had changed, the kind of change you feel before consequences arrive. What nobody understood in that moment was this. That single act done in arrogance, witnessed by the wrong people, would quietly trigger events that would destroy an entire family empire, not overnight, not publicly, but completely. Within months, 5 billion would disappear, not through revenge, not through violence, but through decisions that could never be undone. And the most terrifying part, Chuck Norris would never raise his voice, never make a threat, never ask for justice. He would simply stand still and let the world respond. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone crossed a line and you could feel that everything afterward would change? Because this was one of those moments, and no one in that room realized. They were watching the beginning of the end. Earlier that evening, nothing about the event felt dangerous. It was meant to be quiet, respectable, predictable. A private charity gathering hosted inside one of the city's most exclusive halls, the kind of place where invitations were reviewed twice and names carried more weight than faces. The purpose was simple: appearances, donations, and polite conversations that would later turn into business. Chuck Norris hadn't wanted to attend. Crowds had never appealed to him, especially ones built on status rather than sincerity. But his wife believed moments like this mattered. Not for attention, but for presence. Sometimes showing up is enough, she had said. So they came. Chuck arrived without an entourage. No security detail drawing eyes. No expensive accessories announcing importance. His suit was clean, modest, and unremarkable beside the designer brands surrounding him. That was intentional. Over the years, he had learned something most powerful people eventually forget. Real influence doesn't need decoration. They entered quietly and took their place near the side of the room, greeting a few familiar faces, exchanging polite smiles, nothing more. To the crowd, they looked ordinary, which is exactly why no one paid attention to them at first. Across the hall, laughter erupted near the center table. That was where Richard Hale sat. His family name had been printed on buildings, etched into plaques, whispered through boardrooms for decades. Shipping lanes, energy investments, defense, linked logistics, his empire moved quietly beneath the global economy. And tonight, he was in his element. Executives leaned toward him when he spoke. Younger investors nodded too eagerly. Even the host checked his reaction before announcing speeches. Power, when repeated long enough, becomes intoxicating. Richard had grown accustomed to something dangerous, not being challenged. When he spoke, people agreed. When he joked, people laughed. And when someone didn't respond, he noticed. That was when his eyes drifted toward Chuck, a man standing calmly near the wall. Not networking, not posturing, not trying to be seen. Richard frowned. He watched for a moment longer. No introductions, no name recognition, no visible authority. Just silence. To Richard, silence meant insignificance. He leaned toward one of his associates. "Who's that guy?" The associate shrugged. "Not sure." Richard smirked. "Figures." In his world, value was measured loudly by watches, titles, behavior. Anyone who didn't display status was assumed not to possess it. Meanwhile, Chuck stood listening to his wife speak softly about their children. His son watched the room with quiet curiosity, noticing patterns most people missed, how power clustered, how smiles changed depending on who approached. Chuck noticed it too. He had seen rooms like this before. Places where respect wasn't earned, it was performed. Still, nothing felt wrong yet. Music played gently in the background. Servers glided between guests. Conversations overlapped in practiced rhythm. This was the kind of environment where trouble rarely announced itself. It slipped in disguised as confidence, disguised as humor, disguised as someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. And that's what made moments like this dangerous. Because when everything feels controlled, people stop watching. They assume nothing bad can happen here. They assume wealth equals safety. They assume dignity is guaranteed. Chuck didn't make that mistake. As his eyes scanned the room, he sensed something familiar, not threat, not violence, but imbalance. The kind that appears when pride grows too comfortable. He didn't know yet how it would surface. He only knew one thing. Rooms like this don't break suddenly. They fracture quietly, until one careless act exposes everything beneath the surface. And somewhere behind him, a man with a glass of water had already made up his mind. The moment didn't arrive with shouting. It came quietly, disguised as confidence. Richard Hale stood near the center of the room, glass in hand, half listening to an executive praising his latest acquisition. His attention, however, kept drifting back toward the man near the wall. The quiet one. He watched Chuck speak softly to his wife. No gestures, no forced smiles, no effort to impress anyone. And for reasons Richard couldn't explain, it irritated him. In his world, people either chased attention or hid because they lacked worth. And Richard despised both. He tilted his head slightly and said to the group beside him, "Watch this." A few laughed, assuming it was another harmless joke. Someone muttered, "Richard, don't." But he was already moving. He walked across the polished floor with casual confidence, weaving between tables, his glass still half full. His expression was relaxed, friendly, even the way men look when they believe nothing can go wrong. Chuck noticed him approaching but didn't react. He had learned long ago not to judge intent too early. Richard stopped just short of him. For a brief moment, the two men locked eyes, one filled with assumption, the other with patience. Then Richard smiled and said lightly, "You look like you're enjoying yourself." Before Chuck could respond, Richard flicked his wrist. Water burst forward, splashing across Chuck's face, collar, and jacket. It happened fast, almost playful in motion, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. The room froze. A sharp intake of breath echoed near the back. A woman turned away instinctively. Someone dropped a fork. The water ran down Chuck's jaw and dripped onto the marble floor. His wife gasped softly. His son stepped forward before stopping himself. Every eye locked onto Chuck, waiting for fury, waiting for humiliation to transform into chaos. But nothing happened. Chuck remained still. For 2 full seconds, he didn't move at all. Then, slowly, he reached for a napkin. He wiped his face once. Carefully, deliberately. He folded the napkin and placed it on the table beside him. Only then did he look back at Richard. Not angrily, not challengingly, just directly. The kind of look that doesn't demand attention, it commands reflection. Richard chuckled awkwardly. "Relax. It's just water." A few nervous laughs followed, short, forced, uncertain. But the room didn't return to normal, because humiliation changes the temperature of a space. Chuck's wife whispered, "Let's go." He placed a gentle hand over hers.
"Not yet,"
he said quietly. Richard leaned back on his heel, emboldened by the lack of reaction. "You people take things too seriously." Chuck finally spoke. "You should apologize," he said. His voice was calm, even almost polite. The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Richard blinked. "Excuse me. You disrespected my family," Chuck continued. "That deserves an apology." Silence returned. Deeper this time, the executives nearby avoided eye contact. The servers paused mid-step. Richard stared for a moment, then laughed louder now. "You're serious?" Chuck didn't answer. That refusal unsettled him. Pride stirred. People were watching. And Richard Hale had never backed down in front of witnesses. He stepped closer, invading Chuck's personal space. "You know who I am," he said. Chuck nodded once. "I know who you're choosing to be." That stung. Richard's smile faded. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked. Still no answer. The quiet stretched. Uncomfortable. Dangerous. Then Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." He turned to the crowd. "Some people just don't understand their place." A few faces tightened. Others looked down. Chuck's son clenched his jaw. This wasn't about water anymore. It was about dominance. And dominance, once challenged, rarely retreats gracefully. Richard stepped back, lifting his glass again. this time as a mock toast. To people who think silence makes them important. The glass hovered in the air. For a moment, Chuck thought he might throw it again. Instead, Richard lowered it and smirked. "Lucky for you," he said. "I'm in a good mood tonight." He turned and walked away, laughter following him, thin, uneasy, uncertain. But the damage had already been done. Not just to dignity, to perception. Because several people in that room had seen something they couldn't ignore. A powerful man had crossed a line publicly, and the man he humiliated had not flinched. Have you ever watched someone humiliate another person in public and felt that deep discomfort, knowing it should never have happened? Because moments like this don't end when the laughter fades. They begin something much bigger. And no one in that room realized yet. They had just witnessed the start of a collapse that would cost billions. After Richard walked away, the room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations restarted, cautiously at first, like people unsure whether it was safe to speak. Music returned at a lower volume. Glasses clinked again, though not with the same confidence. But around Chuck and his family, the air remained heavy. His wife's hand trembled slightly as she held his arm. "Chuck," she whispered, "we should leave." He nodded, but not immediately. Because inside him, something deeper was unfolding. Not rage, instinct. The kind that rises before movement, before thought, before consequence. For years, Chuck had trained his body to react faster than fear. Faster than hesitation. Faster than pain. And right now, every part of that training waited for permission. He knew exactly how easily the situation could have turned violent. One motion, 1 second, one decision. But he also knew something else. Something experience had taught him long ago. The moment you react publicly, the story stops being about truth and becomes about spectacle. And spectacle always favors the reckless. His son leaned closer. "Dad, he humiliated us." Chuck met his eyes. "I know," he said softly. "But not every insult deserves your hands." That answer wasn't weakness. It was restraint forged through years of understanding what power truly costs. As they stepped slightly away from the center of the hall, Chuck felt eyes following them. Some filled with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with quiet respect, because people instinctively recognize discipline when they see it. Behind the calm exterior, however, his mind replayed the moment again and again. The splash, the laughter, the silence. He didn't ignore it. He absorbed it. Because Chuck had learned that anger doesn't disappear when suppressed, it transforms when understood. He remembered something his first instructor once told him after a brutal training session. If you strike every time you're provoked, someone else controls your life. That lesson had stayed with him longer than any technique. Tonight it mattered more than ever. His wife finally spoke again. "Why didn't you say more?" He thought for a moment. "Because words can escalate," he replied. "Silence makes people reveal themselves." And Richard had revealed plenty. Not strength, not authority, but insecurity disguised as confidence. Chuck understood something most people in that room did not. Richard didn't splash water because he was powerful. He did it because he needed to feel powerful. There is a difference. As they prepared to leave, Chuck noticed several individuals watching them carefully, not with mockery, but with evaluation. Men and women trained to notice behavioral violations, people whose jobs revolved around patterns. He recognized that look. Years ago, he had seen it in different settings, courtrooms, negotiations, rooms where decisions were made quietly but permanently. He realized then that the incident hadn't ended. It had only changed hands. The world didn't punish arrogance immediately. It recorded it. Outside, the night air felt cooler. His wife exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath the entire time. "I was afraid you'd lose control." Chuck smiled faintly. "I almost did," he admitted. "But losing control feels good for 5 seconds. Then it costs you years." They stood beside the car for a moment before getting in. His son finally asked the question he had been holding inside. "Aren't you angry?" "Yes," he said honestly. "But anger isn't a command. It's information." That answer lingered. Because anger had told him something important that night. Not about Richard. About the system surrounding him. About how easily people confuse wealth with immunity. And how quickly respect disappears when consequences feel distant. As the car pulled away, inside the glowing building behind them, Richard Hale continued laughing. He had no idea anything had changed. He believed he had won. That belief would become his greatest mistake. Because what Richard didn't understand was this. Some actions don't trigger retaliation. They trigger attention. And attention, when focused by the right people, is far more dangerous than confrontation. Nothing happened the next day. No headlines, no phone calls, no public reaction. And that was exactly why it was dangerous. Richard Hale woke up the following morning convinced the night had ended in his favor. The humiliation had earned him laughter. No one had challenged him. The man he embarrassed had walked away quietly. To Richard, that meant victory. He went on with his routine, meetings, calls, negotiations, unaware that something had already shifted beneath the surface. Because power doesn't always respond loudly. Sometimes it observes. At the charity foundation that hosted the event, several staff members were already reviewing footage from the evening. Not for entertainment, for documentation. Security cameras, private recordings, and compliance logs were routine in spaces like that. What caught their attention wasn't the splash itself, it was the behavior surrounding it. Public humiliation, abuse of status, witnesses connected to regulated institutions. One clip was flagged, then forwarded, then quietly archived, not deleted, not shared, just noted. Across the city, a legal consultant who had attended the event as a donor replayed the moment late that night. Not because he was shocked, but because he recognized something. The man who had caused the disturbance was Richard Hale, and Richard Hale's companies were currently involved in multiple active negotiations that depended on reputational trust. The consultant made no report. He simply adjusted his recommendations. Small decisions like that rarely feel important at the time, but when repeated by enough people, they become irreversible. Over the following weeks, subtle changes began appearing. A shipping firm delayed signing a renewal. An insurance underwriter requested updated ethics documentation, unusual, but not alarming. A foreign partner suddenly asked for independent review before continuing expansion talks. Richard dismissed them all. These were normal inconveniences, until they weren't. At one board meeting, an advisor hesitated before speaking. "There's growing sensitivity around leadership conduct," she said carefully. Richard laughed. "Since when does sensitivity run business?" No one answered, because the truth was uncomfortable. The climate had changed. In modern institutions, money no longer protected behavior, it amplified scrutiny, and arrogance created a trail. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris said nothing. He didn't mention the incident publicly, didn't speak about it privately, didn't even search for the man's name. To him, the moment had passed. But something else lingered, not anger, but awareness. He understood that when people reveal themselves, others take note, and systems respond in their own time. 3 months later, the first real crack appeared. A long-standing logistics contract, one that formed a foundation of Richard's holdings, was placed under temporary review. Routine, his team said. Then came another review, then another. Different departments, different jurisdictions, same reason, risk alignment. Richard slammed his hand on the table. This is nonsense, but behind closed doors concern grew. Because reviews meant delays, delays meant exposure, and exposure invited investigation. His legal team scrambled to contain it, but something unusual was happening. Firms that once rushed to represent his interests were now cautious. Some declined altogether. Others raised fees. One senior partner quietly withdrew. No explanation, just distance. And distance in high finance speaks louder than accusation. Inside Richard's family office, whispers began. "Why now? Who started this? Did someone file something?" No one had. That was the terrifying part. Nothing illegal had been reported. Nothing dramatic had occurred. Yet doors were closing. Richard couldn't see the source, only the effect. What he didn't realize was that reputations don't collapse because of one act. They collapse when one act confirms a pattern others were already sensing. The charity gala had not created his downfall. It had exposed it. Months passed. Then one morning, his assistant walked into his office pale. "A major partner is suspending involvement," she said. They cited reputational alignment concerns. Richard stared at her. Based on what? They wouldn't specify. That was when doubt finally entered, not fear. Doubt. Because fear responds to threats. Doubt responds to invisibility. And invisibility cannot be fought. Across boardrooms and legal corridors, the same quiet phrase echoed. We can't afford exposure. No one mentioned Chuck Norris. No one needed to. The world wasn't punishing Richard. It was protecting itself. And protection doesn't argue, it withdraws. Have you ever noticed how the most devastating consequences don't arrive with noise? They arrive with silence. Because when silence spreads, something is already falling. Richard Hale still believed he could fix everything. He believed influence would return, that money would reopen doors. But what he didn't understand, not yet, was this. Once trust begins leaving a room, it never walks back in. and the loss that awaited his family wouldn't come in a single moment. It would arrive piece by piece, until one day the number would finally be spoken aloud. $2.5 billion, and by then, there would be nothing left to stop it. The first headline appeared on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't dramatic, no accusations, no scandal language, just a neutral sentence buried halfway down a financial page. Major logistics partner pauses expansion pending internal review. Richard Hale skimmed past it at first. Then he saw the company name, his company. He reread the article twice, then a third time. Paused was a polite word. It meant frozen. It meant uncertainty. It meant other investors would start asking questions. By noon, his phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Executives wanted meetings. Advisors requested urgent calls. A regional director resigned without explanation. By evening, the stock dipped, only slightly. But markets respond not to numbers, they respond to fear. And fear spreads faster than truth. Inside the family headquarters, the atmosphere changed overnight. The confident rhythm that once defined the building dissolved into tension. People whispered in hallways. Doors closed more often. Meetings ran long and ended with no conclusions. Richard still believed this was temporary. It's noise, he said during an emergency board call. Markets overact. No one agreed openly, but no one reassured him either. The next week, a second partner withdrew, then a third, not permanently, until clarity improved. Clarity never improves once doubt enters. Banks requested additional documentation. Insurance premiums quietly increased. Auditors expanded scope. Each move alone meant little. Together they formed a chokehold. Revenue slowed. Liquidity tightened. And suddenly the empire that once felt unshakable began to feel fragile. Richard's advisors pushed for aggressive action, public statements, legal pressure, influence. But something unusual kept happening. Whenever pressure was applied, resistance increased. Institutions didn't argue. They simply disengaged. One afternoon, Richard stormed into a meeting room and slammed a folder on the table. "Who started this?" he demanded. No one answered, because no one knew there was no lawsuit, no whistleblower, no official accusation, only caution. And caution, once activated, does not require proof. The board grew restless. Some members began speaking of risk distancing. Others hinted at restructuring. A few quietly sold their shares. That was the moment panic entered the room. Within weeks, the stock value fell sharply. Media attention intensified. Analysts speculated about leadership behavior and internal culture. Old stories resurfaced. Not crimes patterns. Moments people once ignored now looked different in hindsight. Power, when questioned, attracts memory. Richard watched his name change in headlines. From industry leader to controversial figure. His family felt it next. Invitations disappeared. Longtime allies avoided gatherings. Phones went unanswered. At home, tension replaced comfort. His wife asked questions he couldn't answer. His children heard whispers at school. For the first time in decades, the Hale name no longer opened doors. It closed them. Then came the report. An independent regulatory review concluded that several subsidiaries no longer met ethical compliance thresholds required for institutional backing. The wording was devastating, not because it accused, but because it disqualified. Within 48 hours, billions in support vanished. Lines of credit collapsed. Contracts unraveled. A cascade followed. Loss after loss. Deal after deal erased. The numbers became impossible to hide. Internal documents revealed the scale: 25 billion. Gone, not stolen. Not seized, withdrawn. Confidence removed, trust revoked. Richard stared at the figure late one night alone in his office. The building was quiet now. The same hallways that once echoed with ambition felt hollow. He replayed everything backward. The meetings, the arrogance, the laughter. And then, inexplicably, his mind returned to that night. The charity hall, the water, the man who hadn't reacted. For the first time, a question formed. Not anger, not denial, understanding. He hadn't been challenged. He had been observed. And the observation had traveled farther than he ever imagined. Meanwhile, miles away, Chuck Norris lived unchanged. No press statements. No celebrations. No acknowledgement. He trained in the mornings. At dinner with his family. Lived quietly. He never heard the final numbers directly. He didn't need to. Because he had already moved on. The collapse wasn't his victory. It was simply the outcome of a truth he understood deeply. Power that humiliates eventually isolates itself. And isolation is fatal. Have you ever seen someone lose everything, not because of one mistake, but because all their past behavior finally caught up with them? Because what followed wasn't anger. It was regret. And in the end, the most painful realization for Richard Hale would not be the money he lost, but the moment he understood It all could have been avoided. With a single apology. The collapse didn't end with noise. There were no flashing lights, no courtroom drama, no public arrest, just silence. The kind that follows after everything important has already left. Richard Hale's office was nearly empty now. The artwork had been taken down. The assistants reassigned. The long conference table where decisions once shaped markets sat untouched. He arrived early one morning, long before anyone else. Old habits. He sat alone and stared through the glass wall at a city that no longer seemed to recognize him. The empire his family had spent generations building was gone. Not destroyed, abandoned. Partners had walked away. Institutions had withdrawn support. The money hadn't vanished. It had simply chosen not to stay. What remained was reputation. And reputation, once cracked, never fully heals. Richard tried to explain it to his family. To his wife, who had stopped attending social functions altogether. To his children, who asked why their last name suddenly felt heavy. He had no good answer. Because how do you explain that everything was lost, without a single enemy? Weeks later, a journalist reached out with a request for comment. Not about financial losses. About the night at the charity event. The water, the silence. The man who never reacted. Richard declined the interview. But that night, alone again, he replayed the memory for the first time without excuses. He remembered how easily he had laughed, how confident he felt, how important he thought he was, and how small the other man had made him feel, without ever raising his voice. It wasn't fear that haunted him. It was clarity. He finally understood something no amount of money had taught him. The world does not punish cruelty immediately. It records it. And when the time comes, it responds through distance. Distance from opportunity, distance from loyalty, distance from protection. He searched the man's name online. Chuck Norris. The articles were simple, respectful, quiet. No statements about the incident, no commentary, no satisfaction, just a man who lived his life without needing validation. That realization hurt more than the loss itself. Because it meant the humiliation had never been the point. The lesson had been, across town. Chuck sat at his kitchen table one evening, helping his grandson with homework. The television murmured in the background, reporting on markets and mergers. A headline passed briefly across the screen. He didn't look up. His wife poured tea. Life continued. Nothing in his world had changed. And that was the most powerful truth of all. He hadn't acted out of strategy. He hadn't waited for revenge. He had simply chosen dignity and allowed the world to reveal itself. Months later, the Charity Foundation released a quiet internal memo on conduct standards. No names mentioned, no accusations. Just one line that stood out: respect is not optional. It is the foundation of trust. Richard read it online, and for the first time since the collapse, he felt something close to regret, not because of the money, not because of the status, but because one sincere apology, offered in that room, would have changed everything. He never sent it. Some apologies arrive too late, and some lessons arrive only after the cost has been paid. The story spread slowly across the internet, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as a reminder. People didn't share it because someone lost billions. They shared it because someone chose restraint. Because in a world obsessed with dominance, the calm response felt rare and unforgettable. The truth became clear to everyone who heard it. The strongest person in the room is not the one who humiliates. It's the one who refuses to become small in response. Because power doesn't shout. It doesn't splash water. It doesn't seek attention. Real power waits. And when the world finally responds, it does so without asking who you thought you were. More meaningful stories like this are coming. Tell us which part stayed with you the most, so we can make the next one even better.